There was a moment I was standing on the sidelines of a soccer game and it was sleeting rain. It was watching a bunch of 9-year-olds play soccer. All the parents were soaked. And I looked at the other parents on the sidelines and I was like, why are we even doing this? And no one answered me. That's okay. But I kept thinking to myself, why are we even doing this? And then the varsity blues scandal hit.
Welcome to Success Reimagined. I am Dr. Amna Shabir, your host on this journey to thrive at the intersection of ambition and wellness. In every episode, I'll help you challenge outdated definitions of success, discover practical tools and strategies for growth without compromising your well-being. I am so glad you've joined me. Let's reimagine what's possible together. Today, I have a dynamic guest on the show whose work has deeply impacted the globe and personally shaped me both as an individual, a high achiever, and as a parent. Jennifer Wallace is an award-winning journalist and author of the instant New York Times bestselling book, Never Enough: When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It. Her second book, Mattering in the Modern World, A Solution to the Crisis of Our Time, is based on 5 years of research and an original global mattering survey, further establishing her as a leading voice on the intersection of well-being, mattering, and societal pressures. A graduate of Harvard College, Jennifer began her career as a producer at CBS's 60 Minutes, where she was part of the team that won the Robert F. Kennedy Awards for Excellence in Journalism. She has since contributed to prominent publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and frequently appears on national television programs to discuss her work. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Never Enough explores the impact of achievement culture. When I read it, I instantly felt seen and heard. It's like you were inside my head, my teenage brain, and had witnessed my entire lived experience. Here's my copy, and I took the plunge of reaching out to you. And I thought that, why would Jennifer reply? It was December 2023. I was on the beach, and you replied, and that further just cemented your incredible presence, not just with the work that you do, but as a human. So I really, first of all, want to thank you for the work that you've done.
Thank you. And I have to say, it's the highest compliment for a journalist, an author, a human, when someone else feels seen and then they tell you that they connected with your work. It's really, I have to say, it's a gift that you gave me.
Thank you so much for saying that. Jumping right in and into your work, can you please share the pivotal moments in your personal or professional journey that inspired you to write Never Enough? Was there a specific event you observed, or it was a string of events and you realized that you had to address perfectionism, mattering, and belonging?
So I would say both. It was a gradual and then it was all of a sudden. So gradually over the years, I was noticing how different my children's childhood was from my own growing up. I like to think that I have similar values to my parents. I enjoy family dinners and downtime on the weekends, but so much of our lives seemed hijacked by performance, achievement-oriented goals. And it wasn't sitting well with me. My husband would be taking one to travel soccer. I'd be joining another at a chess tournament on the weekends. The together time as a family, I was really missing. So that was one thing that was weighing in my head. Why are we doing this? And actually, there was a moment I was standing on the sidelines of a soccer game and it was sleeting rain. It was watching a bunch of 9-year-olds play soccer. All the parents were soaked. And I looked at the other parents on the sidelines and I was like, why are we even doing this? And no one answered me. That's okay. But I kept thinking to myself, why are we even doing this? And then the varsity blues scandal hit. And if you remember, that was parents from the East Coast and the West Coast that got caught up in an illegal bribery scheme to get their kids into highly selective schools. And I thought to myself, how did we get to the point now where parents were going to jail to get their kids into specific colleges? And I wasn't buying the narrative that they just wanted bumper stickers. I felt like there was something more going on, something deeper, something larger. And that's really what set me on my journey. And then the final thing was in 2019, I wrote an article for the Washington Post where I was covering 2 national policy reports. One was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the other, the National Academies of Sciences. And as these are 2 reports written by the country's leading child psychologists, developmental psychologists, and they were pointing to who were the youth who were most at risk for negative health outcomes today. And they named children, as you might suspect, children living in poverty, children with
Mm.
incarcerated parents, children of recent immigrants with few resources, children living in foster care. And then they named a new at-risk group, students attending what the researchers were calling high achieving schools. These are public and private schools all around the country where the kids go off to competitive four-year colleges. These schools were now creating environments that were putting young people at risk. They were found to be 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. And so I wanted to know, I mean, my kids go to these high achieving schools. I wanted to know, what was this pressure? Why were they feeling this excessive pressure to achieve?
That is so powerful. There's so much there that you just shared. And even in that, I saw glimmers of myself both as that high achiever and as that parent that you were talking about. And I love the question that you asked, why are we even doing this? And often it's responded with deafening silence. And I will look around sometimes when I'm asking that question now, and I tell everybody, the fellow moms around me, like, you can unclutch your pearls. It's okay. Let's ask this question. And even the recent Surgeon General report that came out about parents being tired, and we're tired. We're tired. And why are we doing this? Where at the end, we're just causing so much anxiety in our young adults. And what is it leading to? You really emphasize the concepts of mattering and belonging as critical antidotes to perfectionism. How do you define these terms, and why do you think they're so essential to counter the negative effects of achievement culture?
So for the book, I went mostly in search of the kids who were doing well
Mm.
despite the pressure. I wanted to know what they had in common. What was home life like? What did their parents say to them? How did they experience school? What did they see as their place in the wider world? And I found about a dozen threads that these healthy strivers, as I call them in the book, had in common. But it boiled down to this idea that the kids who were doing well, who were able to reset after setbacks and failures, felt like they mattered for who they were at their core. They did not place their worth. They did not allow their worth to rest on their achievements. So when they failed, when they didn't live up to their expectations, instead of spiraling down or turning against themselves, becoming anxious and depressed, or turning to substances to alleviate the pain, they reached out to others. They felt like they were worthy of support. They opened up. One of the things that is so hard about perfectionism is the idea that when you are a perfectionist, you feel like you can't reach out for support, because then that is an indictment of your worth. Just that reaching out for support is proving that you are not perfect, that you are not enough. And I often think about this when I was looking at the healthy strivers and also the healthy achievers in my own adult life. And it's not the people who appear shiny and slick on the outside that allow us to connect with each other. I like to think of it visually as a sticky, rough surface. This vulnerability is what allows you to connect with someone else. When you're too slick, you slide off. There's no connection, there's nothing to adhese to. And so, what mattering does is it just gives you this kind of unconditional self worth. And so that is what I saw as the antidote to perfectionism, the belief that you are worthy of support.
Unconditional is the word over there that really speaks to me, because everything in there is what we're essentially lacking, not just for young adults, but then we continue to perpetuate these narratives into our adult life. I think it's time to just relax and shift from a performance based identity to a value based identity and really just lean into that, because I do feel that it is never enough and it is such an unfulfilling way to live. I was also speaking with a bunch of clinicians recently and hospital leadership, I would say. And the phrase I used was that nobody leaves a hospital system or an organization because they have to do 3 extra clicks. They leave because they feel like they don't belong and what they do doesn't matter and their worth doesn't matter. What comes up for you when I say that?
I think that's exactly right. What I heard over and over again from the parents that I interviewed and the adults that I interviewed was that no matter where they were working these days, they often felt, like cogs in a machine. They felt interchangeable. They didn't feel uniquely seen and known. And that is many times at the root of burnout. William Damon studies purpose in young people at Stanford, and he said, it's not stress necessarily that is causing so much mental health damage. It's meaninglessness. It's feeling like what we do does not have meaning, that we are not connected to our impact. And I love your idea of the values-based identity versus goal-based identity. You had a better term than that,
Yes.
achievement management. So one
Hmm.
of the things that I found fascinating in my research was how our values impact our well-being. So just to oversimplify this quickly, no matter where we live in the world, researchers find we all have about a dozen core values inside all of us, that they split up into extrinsic values and intrinsic values. Extrinsic values are, you know, wanting to get the fellowship or the brand name title, the big house, popularity, looking a certain way. These things are extrinsic values. Intrinsic values are things like wanting to be pro-social, wanting to be a good neighbor, wanting to grow as a person. Those are intrinsic values. And the more, and values operate like a zero-sum game. So the more time and energy you put into pursuing extrinsic values, the less room you have in your life for pursuing the intrinsic ones. And here's why this matters. Extrinsic values are linked with negative mental health and substance abuse disorder. Intrinsic values are linked with the well-being that we want for ourselves and that we want for our kids. And so it doesn't mean never to be motivated by shiny things. Yes, you can want shiny things in your life, but what you need is balance. We are imbalanced as a society. And it's not that high performers in these high achieving communities don't have good values. It's that our extrinsic values are constantly being activated with people's LinkedIn post promotions or who's getting celebrated at the hospital, who's getting celebrated in the workplace. So at home, in our interior lives, we need to know that we have these extrinsic values being activated. And we need, the first step is really just to have that awareness and to be able to say, ah, I see. So now this weekend, I'm going to focus on the intrinsic values to give myself more of that well-being that I need and crave, to buffer against this overemphasis of our modern culture on extrinsic values.
Absolutely. I love that you said it's a zero-sum game and we only have finite time on earth. So what is capturing our attention? And as I do this work surrounding perfectionism and trying to understand my own struggles with it, I really have come to recognize that discontent is the word that comes to my mind with everything that we have to do. It is a comparison game. There's so much big money being thrown at us in every which way. And it has been even before social media. Social media has made the game just it's just on steroids now. And recognizing that regrounding ourselves in a balance, like you mentioned, of the extrinsic and intrinsic values is so important. I love this passage from the book, and I'm going to read some of it. The bar for what is exceptional keeps rising, offering our kids more and more ways to feel like they're not enough. Children absorb constant messages from our achievement culture that they need to be thin, rich, smart, beautiful, athletic, and talented to be worthy of likes, love, and attention. Like dutiful soldiers, our kids comply with these crazy demands. Over time, they internalize them. For today's kids, it's less about measuring up than measuring over. Everyone needs to stand out from the crowd. When I read that, it really hit home. It's not about measuring up, it's measuring over. And I just turned around and looked at both of my daughters and I was like, am I already doing this? They're right now, they are 8 and 5.5. But I feel that pressure is really there. I almost question, the preschooling, was that up to standard? Is kindergarten going well? I would love to hear your thoughts a little bit more about why you chose measuring over rather than measuring up.
So, what I was reading in the research on students in these high achieving schools, one of the things that really stuck out to me was this excessive envy that it fosters in young people. When we look back before we were in this hyper achievement culture, we had buffers in place for our kids. Their friendships, yes, you might be competing with one or two friends, but friendships themselves were sources of support, more so than I heard today, where kids see their friends as competitors. for that spot at an elite college or that leadership position or the spot in AP calculus. And what I learned and what was valuable to me as a parent was to understand that envy is rampant in these environments and to actually speak with my kids about it, to name the elephant in the room, to say to my children, it is normal to feel envy. We all feel it. You are maybe sensing in your environment that you need to do better, you need to be better, but you don't have to look at your relationships as zero sum. And so I said, instead of judging yourself for feeling envy, instead hold yourself accountable for how you act on that envy. So when envy inevitably bubbles up because you're in these competitive environments, you can take two paths. You can take the unhealthy route. Malicious envy is what researchers call it, where you cut somebody down or you do something to damage their reputation. Or you can take the healthy route. You can look at the source of your inspiration as a source of your envy as inspiration. You can even ask them, what is it? I so admire what you did. Would you tell me how you got there? I'd love to try to get there too. And I think talking about these things that are now just a part of the pond our kids are swimming in, normalizing it, telling our kids you don't have to hold it inside, you don't have to judge yourself. We can talk about it, and I can help you use healthy tools to create bonds in our relationships instead of allowing this hyper competition to break friendships apart.
That really is addressing the elephant in the room. That right there, because nobody even wants to talk about the word envy in and of itself, taking it into very negative connotation. And I loved how you broke this down in the book as well. I completely have that part highlighted. As you look at the feelings of perfectionism and specifically this achievement-oriented mindset in today's culture, how would you, in very simple terms, for yourself, identify this? I'll just read another. All of my favorite lines in the book are there, but when I read this statistic, it really shook me to my core. There's a startling rise in perfectionism in young adults. Over the past 40 years, a striking 33% increase over time in the level of unrealistic expectations placed on them by society and by well-meaning but pressuring parents. And you've coded very elegantly, well-meaning but pressuring parents. Now that I am a parent, I'll add the well-meaning part. Before, it didn't feel as much.
I will tell you that I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago when that study came out by Tom Curran in the UK. And I was looking at what might be causing this. And he points to macroeconomic forces. So when we say well-meaning parents are maybe fostering this perfectionism in young people, you have to think back. When I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, life was generally more affordable. Housing was more affordable, healthcare was more affordable, higher education was more affordable. There was slack in the system. So parents like mine could be a little bit more hands off, be pretty assured that even with setbacks, even with a B minus in AP calculus, like I got my senior year, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood as an adult, if not do even better than my own parents did. But modern parents are facing a different reality. We are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who on average are not doing as well as their parents. We've seen the crush of the middle class. And so we are absorbing these microeconomic forces and becoming, in the words of researchers, social conduits, passing those fears about the future onto our kids in the hopes of preparing them. But instead of preparing them, instead of trying to nurture them so that they could ride these unknown waves of the future, we are stressing them too much. We are giving them too much weight that's developmentally inappropriate. And the way that they are coping with it, perfectionism is a coping strategy. It's a maladaptive coping strategy, but it's a coping strategy. It's a way that a child copes with the excessive demands of a parent, because if they don't cope with them, it could lead to death, starvation, right? We rely on our adult caregivers to get us through this long period into self-sustaining adulthood. And so perfectionism becomes this strategy in order to live in the home and keep that connection healthy, But that perfectionism does not serve us. And so I think, again, perfectionism is passed down from parent to parent. It's a kind of family heirloom. And I think
Mm.
a way of thinking about perhaps well-meaning parents is that most likely they were parented by parents who were perfectionistic in certain ways. And so they've not necessarily rummaged through their psychological attics to really look at those messages and come to terms with them. And I would say to anyone thinking about being a parent or a parent today to really think about therapy. If you feel like you are really suffering from perfectionism, to unpack it, it's unpackable. You can take it apart. You can find healthier coping strategies. And therefore, you could act as not only a force for giving your kids sort of the healthy fuel that they need to develop, but also alleviating your own unnecessary suffering.
That was so well said. And I love that you quoted Tom Curran's work because I like how he mentioned that perfectionism is our favorite flaw. And you're drawing attention to the fact that it is a coping mechanism, it is a family heirloom. Wow. I'm going to hold on to those words because they really resonate with me. And I am looking at it from the side of somebody who has gone through this journey. And now I am leaning towards what I call is my undoing, and my anti-perfectionism time of life is coming in and leaning into authenticity. Also in his work, I like how he draws attention to that it is a societal problem and not just an individual problem, because with the way we are right now, everything is a you problem. Therefore, you have to go fix it. And the work that you're doing with mattering, belonging, institutional level work, it just brings attention to a very different way viewing perfectionism.
Thank you for saying that. I like to say that we tend to personalize instead of contextualize what's going on. So we think it's just us. And so by being authentic, as you're saying, and opening up and talking about these things and saying, it's not you, it's these macro forces. It doesn't take you off the hook. You still have to do the work, but it's not your fatal flaw. It's something in the wider environment. And you have a role here to unpack those unhealthy messages and find a healthier path forward for yourself.
Yes. And I will also highlight fear-based parenting is the word I would use right now because I really feel this 360 because people look at me, you're a physician and then you've gone through this journey. And I will look at my children right now. I already will have to catch myself. And the family heirloom part hits really home because last night my daughter got a 99 out of 100 on one of her tests, and she said, "Don't even look at it." I know I was awful. And really, like, when she said that, I was just scared. I was so scared for her and also so worried that what did I do? And I'm trying very hard not to be that way. So what would you say to somebody who's a mom like me and her daughter reacts this way? What would you say to her?
I would say to her, it's not just you as a parent that's giving these messages to your child around achievement. They're hearing it at school, from their peers' parents, from the wider society, but that do as you're doing at home, trying to make your home a haven from the pressure. Our kids already know we want them to be successful. We put them in these high achieving public and private schools. We are surrounded by high achieving adults. We are high achieving ourselves. So, what I have realized my job at home is to call out the unhealthy messages around achievement. So, my daughter was also that way, very hard on herself. And I remember writing a sticky note that I talk about, I think, in the book that says, your worth does not equal your grades. And so I was very intentional about how I reacted to all grades, good grades and bad grades. I did not celebrate good grades. I did not criticize bad grades. I tried to stay really level. And if she comes back with a good grade, you must be so excited. You must be really proud of yourself. But my self esteem is not contingent on your performance. So I love you and I am steady, and my love is read by you, hopefully consistently, no matter what you bring home.
My self-esteem is not contingent on your grades. I am definitely going to be writing this on a sticky and putting that everywhere as well. Thank you for sharing that. So, expanding from individual level and things that we're doing at our home, what do you think needs to change on an institutional and cultural level so we can talk about schools, workplaces, or communities to create an environment that promotes not just an antidote to perfectionism, like all of these toxic pressures that are coming in, and how can we like promote belonging and mattering in those spots and spaces?
So I was very lucky for the book to be able to go into schools that were really leading with mattering. They weren't necessarily calling it mattering because that term has been locked away in an ivory tower until my book came out, but they were very much doing the practicing the principles of mattering. So one school that I visited was in Cleveland, Ohio, St. Ignatius. It's a Jesuit school. And they adopted a motto that I've adopted, and I think all schools should adopt, which is not better than others, but better for others. So, how can we, as schools, as institutions, as workplaces, foster this idea that life is not zero sum and that your peers' success is your success? This idea of vicarious joy, of getting joy and from someone else, it gets beaten out of us in this hyper achievement culture. But I will tell you, it is such a better way to go through life from adolescence into adulthood if you see others not as competitors, but as people there. It's funny because I'm thinking about Timothy Galway, who is a famous sports psychologist, and he wrote a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And in it, he uses this metaphor of a surfer and a big wave. Why does the surfer wait for a big wave if the goal is to make it on shore? Why not sort of take a smaller wave where you could be assured to make it onto shore? And Galway writes, the surfer waits for the big wave because he wants to test his capacity. He wants to see what he can do if he can perform against the big wave. And so if we see rivals in the workplace or competitive peers trying to get the same outcomes as we are, not as this sum, but rather as someone who is working, who is creating obstacles to make your life better, to bring out your strengths, and for you to bring out your strengths to help them become better too. So when we can shift our mindsets away from this zero sum and instead see that we are all interconnected and that everyone's success rises us all. It's a mindset. I think we need to start with the mindset and start giving language to these ideas.
Very beautifully stated. And I had not heard the term mattering formally till I read Never Enough. So you're right, it was locked up. And belonging maybe here and there. When I was doing my fellowship at Duke, I heard it over there. So we were doing diversity, equity work surrounding there, but mattering in specific, no. And drawing that attention into that really beautiful mindset shift on such a larger level, I can foresee that creating ripple effects everywhere. What a beautiful space to live life from, abundance and collegiality, and taking away from all of what's happening right now, which is a life that is filtered, hyper competitive. And also, at the end of the day, you're feeling extremely hollow. That's a feeling that I would say has been front and center when I was maybe picked up your book. I was struggling with hollow was the word. And I was at the beach and I read the book, and it really changed my mindset at that time. So looking ahead, as we're talking about visioning and we're talking about mattering and belonging, being prioritized over perfectionism, how do you think that the work in Never Enough can contribute to a cultural shift? I know we have touched on some points, but just big picture, I want this work to be read by everyone. I think all educators need to read it. All parents need to read it. My parents definitely need to read it. I'm sending back to them. So I would love your thoughts on that larger vision you have.
Eh, So, two things I'll say. The first one is when I was digging into the research on how to help our kids become more resilient in these high achieving communities, I saw decades worth of resilience research that points to the best thing we can do for our kids. And that is to shore up our own resilience, our own self-worth, our mental health, so that we can be first responders to our kids' struggles day in and day out. How do we do that? Not with bubble baths, not with what the multi-billion-dollar wellness industry tries to sell us, but through deep, nourishing relationships. So we often say that kids need a sturdy adult, right? That for healthy development. Sturdy adults need sturdy adults too. And so when I think about it's why I'm actually writing my second book, because if we are going to, what we need to do is really upstream prevention, and we need to help the adults in their lives. What is one place that we could really help adults? Mattering at work. So how can adults go to work day in and day out for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, feel replaceable, feel like they don't belong, they don't matter, that they're not making an impact that's noticeable to others? How can they show up every day to be that first responder for their kids? They can't. So I think one of the ways that we could really scale this is to start focusing on mattering at work. Mattering at work is a way to feed the adults in our kids' lives, mattering in our neighborhoods, finding third spaces beyond work and home where we can matter. In some ways, I'm just developing this idea. So it's not, it's new. So I'm going to just put it out there that I'm still working on it. But this idea that as we become such a secular culture, we've created this huge unmet need in so many adults. And materialism, social media has gone in to feed that need, but mattering could be a healthier way to feed that need. And in some ways, mattering is the secular response for being part of something bigger than ourselves. Think about scaling it. I think about shoring up the mattering in the adults in our kids' lives. That's how we can scale it.
Mattering at the workplace, mattering in communities, that is huge. And what I'm seeing, mattering is also an antidote to the loneliness epidemic that we're all going through. I love that you draw the attention to the focus on this individualism. Everyone has to pull themselves up by the bootstrap, don't ask for help, and look flawless while we're doing it. And so this can definitely be that antidote that you bring. And so when can I read Mattering and the Modern World?
I can't wait to read it too. I'm still working on it. It's due in the spring, and so it'll be out in 2026. But I will be talking about it on my Instagram and LinkedIn and in my newsletters. So you don't have to wait until 2026 to start getting some of the principles of mattering in adulthood.
I can't wait. I know that this is going to be fabulous and amazing and so impactful. I do have a question before we move towards wrapping up, and I kept it for the end because it's a bit of a sensitive question. I also want to give the listeners a warning that I'm going to be talking about suicide. So if this is not for you, please stop listening here. And if you feel like you need attention, please call 988. That is the hotline. So as we look at, Jennifer, this work surrounding perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism, and I'm talking specifically about high achievers and perfectionists, where does the risk for suicide and maladaptive perfectionism in your research and work and your vast knowledge shows up? Because as I am very passionate about advocating for mental health for healthcare workers and doing the work surrounding that and doing my own research, it seems like perfectionism is something we don't talk about, how that is tying to our risk for suicide.
That is right. If you want to zoom out, perfectionism is rooted in the idea that my mattering is contingent on being perfect. And so what we can do in these circumstances is, one, to make sure that the environments that these people are in are mattering environments, that they feel valued. But just as importantly, we need to look at the environments and the anti-mattering messages that might be sent. So it's a two-pronged approach. Mattering is really double-edged. So it's great and healthy when we feel it, but it could be highly destructive when we don't feel it. We've seen in the news, school shootings. We've seen the shootings of CEOs. These are anti-mattering, acting out messages. Oh, I don't matter. I'll show you I matter. So as important as it is to create cultures of mattering, it's just as important to be aware and dismantle cultures that send the signal that you don't matter.
Wow. I'm going to emphasize what you just said, specifically for leaders in healthcare, as we head towards what I look at, a very disturbing future for our healthcare workforce. I have, at my worst with burnout, I have had days where I felt so helpless because the element of moral injury was very much there, which brings about this feeling of what I do doesn't matter and I can't do what I want to do. So where the hurdles come from, all the clicks and the insurance jumps that we have to do, all of those things. I definitely felt that what I do doesn't matter and I don't belong. I don't belong. And so I'm very grateful that you have highlighted this very real and you've given it words. And the words are what we need. When language is present, then actions can follow. And all organizations that are invested in their well-being for their employees, including those in healthcare, will take this very seriously.
Yes. And what you're naming is the psychic pain that this sort of, they call it mute suffering when we don't have words for it. But you're right, without the language, we can't make the invisible feelings visible, and we can't get our needs met without being able to express what those needs are. So thank you for all of your work in helping people get their needs met.
Thank you so much for sharing this. This has been incredible. What are some of your parting thoughts, takeaways that you want to share with our audience?
I would say to adopt the mantra that I learned from Ned Hallowell, who's a psychiatrist: never worry alone. If we could just keep that in our minds when we are in a dark place, when we are worried, when we are riddled with anxiety, never worry alone. Reach out. Reaching out is not selfish. Reaching out is not weak. Reaching out, in my mind, is actually an act of generosity, because what you do in that moment is that you say to the person you are asking for help, I trust you. I believe in you. I value you. And so you, by reaching out, are allowing someone to feel like they matter in being able to help you.
I hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you have not yet read Jennifer's book, Never Enough, I highly encourage you to do so. You'll find links to it in the show notes. This episode is part of a special series and my budding book project on unmasking perfectionism. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. Just a quick reminder, while I am a physician, I'm not your physician, and nothing in this podcast is medical advice or any kind of professional advice. Everything shared here is based on my personal experiences, and the views expressed are entirely my own. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would love for you to rate, review, subscribe, and share the show with anyone who might need a little inspiration to redefine their own version of success. I'll see you next time. Until then, keep reimagining success one small step at a time.